Welcome to the latest edition of Don't Take This as Gospel. Now, I know that last time I said I was going to be getting into the Ten Commandments today, but it just happened I was catching up on some Styx Hexenhammer 666 videos, and he had a commentary about the Pope's recent declarations that he was okay with civil unions for gay couples. And he made a little bit of a religious blooper. Now, if anyone's not familiar with Styx Hexenhammer 666, he's a very, very prominent YouTuber and bit shooter, and he's very prominent on multiple platforms. He's one of the most followed people on those platforms. And he comments on politics. He comments on, he has, I think he makes his living off of his religious books. He puts together compilations or new editions of religious texts that have gone into the public domain, but at the same time are not very well accessible or understandable in the translations that they're at. So he makes new versions of those. So anyway, if you want to go check out his channel, I highly recommend going to do so. He may not be your cup of tea if you're an especially religious person, as he's against organized religion of whatever kind. Which is why he was getting on Catholicism's case in this particular case. But he made kind of a blooper when it comes to Catholicism, in that the Pope basically stated his own opinion, his personal opinion, that civil unions, which is just basically the marriage contract, or not even marriage per se, but the civil contract that basically gives gay couples, like, visitation rights, property rights, the kinds of financial and uh, judicial bells and whistles that go along with marriage, but it keeps it from being called marriage per se. Uh, and when the Pope was giving his opinion on this, that these were okay, Styx Hexenhammer 666 referred to this as an ex cathedra opinion. Now, any Catholic will tell you that, any educated Catholic will tell you that ex cathedra is the exact opposite of personal opinion. If a pope is teaching anything ex cathedra, that means he's teaching, and this is, I think, what the Latin stands for, from the chair of Peter. Peter being the first and foremost of the apostles, and the one who Christ is said to have given the keys to the kingdom and the keys to the gates of heaven, etc., etc. So papal primacy is based on the Pope's dissension from all these apostolic successors, one after the other, filling the seat of the Church of Rome, where Peter was presumably martyred. And I say presumably a lot when it gets into Christian history, because you never really know what's the real story and what's just legend. But with regard to Peter, it's said that he was crucified upside down in Rome, upside down because he didn't feel like he merited to be crucified in the exact same way that Christ was. So ever since then, and maybe even before then, but I don't think the Bible supports this. It was thought that Peter had the final say on matters of doctrine in the church. And this papal infallibility, or this teaching ex cathedra, was something that was passed down from successor to successor, all the way down to the current Pope Francis. Now, what does ex cathedra mean from a doctrinal standpoint? Well, it means that when the Pope teaches in this particular mode, which is ex cathedra, which is from the chair of Peter, and he is proclaiming a matter of morals and faith, and only that. I mean, it wouldn't apply if he were talking about it wouldn't apply if he were talking about science. It wouldn't apply if he were talking about whether Lost is better than X-Files. It wouldn't apply to any of that kind of trivial crap. It only applies in matters of faith and morals. So what you have to take into account is this a matter of faith and morals, and it's when it comes to civil unions, you could say that it's strictly a political matter, and therefore it doesn't really fall under the ex cathedra umbrella. But more importantly, you really have to declare, most of the time, you really have to declare that you are teaching ex cathedra and that you are defining a certain stance on faith and morals that all Catholics are bound to respect. And that's another aspect of ex cathedra, is that it has to be a matter of faith and morals that is binding on all Catholics. So, if it's a matter of you can take it or leave it, that's not something the Pope's going to declare ex cathedra. So, personal opinion, totally different from ex cathedra, and I was just a little bit surprised that Styx Hex and Hammer 666 kind of got that one wrong. Um, Going back to ex cathedra teaching for a second, what are the examples of ex cathedra teaching in Catholicism? Now, I actually have a book on papal primacy, talking about arguing for and I guess strictly for the primacy of the Pope in defining these matters. I haven't read that yet, so I'm not going to go into a history of papal infallibility, other than to say here are the 3 or 4 things that I know that the Pope has supposedly defined infallibly. One thing is um, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, what does that mean? The Eucharist is the Lord's Supper. It is a ceremony that is conducted by Christians, which commemorates both the Last Supper that he shared with the apostles and his crucifixion. Because in the Last Supper, as recorded mainly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Christ takes Passover bread and Passover wine, and it may or may not have actually been the Passover. It may have been a meal that was preceding the Passover, and that's on account of a conflict in the timelines that John introduces. But Christ takes the bread and he breaks it, and he says, "This is my body, which is broken for you. And do this in remembrance of me." And then he also takes the wine and he says, "This is the cup of my blood of the New Testament. Drink this in remembrance of me." Now, Catholics and Orthodox and certain other Christian denominations take that to be literal. Take that to when Christ said, "This is my body, this is my blood," he was actually effecting a transformation in the bread and wine that he was serving to the apostles. And I've never seen it, in terms of course, I've never seen, actual. It doesn't turn into flesh and blood. It doesn't turn into meat. That the bread doesn't become meat in your mouth. Like like bacon flavored Cheez-Its, and the wine does not turn to from a white wine to a red or anything like that. What the Catholic Church officially teaches with regard to that is a doctrine called transubstantiation, where every substance that we see, there's substances and there's accidents of those substances. This is getting a little far afield, but I'll go into it anyway. Like, for example, the substance of me is that I'm a human being, but the accidents of me, as you can see, like I'm white, I have a certain smell, everybody does. My voice sounds a certain way, but the substance of me is a human being, and maybe if the substance of me were to change so that I were actually a frog, but this interface were to still remain, which would be my accidents, so that even if I were a frog on the inside, I were still presenting to you as a human being, then that would be the kind of thing that's going on with the Eucharist. They say that the bread and the wine actually do change into flesh and blood of Christ, except that the outward appearance of it that we can sense, all the taste, all the if there's any aroma to it, if there's how it sounds when it breaks. All those things are still in place. So it's the substance that changes, but the accidents that don't. Other Christian denominations don't try and get that far down into the weeds. In fact, the Orthodox were basically saying, well, it could be like that, but we just don't really know, and we don't try to say. We think it actually does happen in some way, but we can't tell you how. And then it goes all the way down the spectrum to the Southern Baptists, who would just basically say it's symbolic, which to me, that's always been the view that makes a lot more sense, because, Jesus is sitting right there with his apostles saying, this is my body, and it's not changing, although you would think that, since he has had the ability to give people new eyes and new legs and heal their wounds, he could absolutely make it change into actual flesh and blood. And savory to boot if he wanted to. I've always taken it to be more of a symbolic thing, but each religion has its own spin on that, and the heavy evidence of the early Christian fathers is to say that they believed too that the bread and wine actually became the body and blood of Christ. So that's one thing that the Pope has declared, in some way, shape, or form, ex cathedra to be a real thing, that Christ is actually and truly present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. The second and third are easier to point out because I couldn't point you to an actual declaration of when the Pope declared that or when the Pope taught that ex cathedra. It might be in one of the ecumenical councils that the Vatican's held since the schism, and I'll go into some Christian history in a later video. Uh, the the second dogma and the third dogma that were infallibly declared were absolutely declared. I mean, they were declared in papal encyclicals, and the wording and the verbiage was deliberately constructed to basically say, I am acting as Pope from the chair of Peter to define these dogmas. And the first time that was ever actually done was in 1850-ish. I think it was 1850 with the Declaration of the Immaculate Conception. Or was that 1850? I think so. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And what's interesting about that is that it was coming out around the time that evolution was hitting the scene, that Darwin had published, and it was also around the time that people understood pregnancy a lot better. It's really and human reproduction a lot better. It's really interesting that human reproduction is something that was not really all that well understood until about the 1850s, and it was right around that same time that the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed. And the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, it basically says that Mary, this has nothing to do with Jesus, that Mary, well, it has a little bit in this later sense, was immaculately conceived through a special dispensation of God. That in order so that she could be a perfect vessel for God's Son, that she was preserved by a miracle from any stain of original sin. Now, her parents were not so preserved. Jesus himself was so preserved, but the Catholics look upon that as his being God in the flesh. That how could he inherit sin? Now by the way, this is not a universally held belief, but it is universally held among Catholics, and it has to be on account of the fact that the Pope proclaimed it ex cathedra. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this was an example of what I would say, establishing your power before the power has been defined. Because prior to 1871, I think, 1871 was when they issued the papal encyclical that basically said that the Pope actually has this power. But it was 1850 that Pope Pius the Ninth, I think it is, went and used that power. So he actually used the power before the Catholic Church defined what the power is. And I think that was kind of on purpose. It was kind of like to say, I'm going to do it, and you're going to either go along with it, or we're going to have, another schism. And the Catholics at Vatican I decided to go along with it. So that was the first of the dogmas, and that was actually unilaterally declared. So you've got the real presence, you've got the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and then you have another Marian dogma, which actually wasn't proclaimed until, I want to say, the 1950s, around the same time that we put under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. So the Assumption of Mary is the third dogma, and it is the dogma that at the end of Mary's earthly life, and this kind of leaves it open-ended as to whether or not she actually died on earth and has spent any time on earth dead, that at the end of her earthly life she was assumed body and soul into heaven, so that her remains are not on earth. She was basically resurrected or passed directly from life on earth into life in heaven as a special dispensation of God, kind of saying a well done for being the mother of God. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice, and it's kind of funny, I've heard it said that this particular Marian dogma was may have been believed for a while, but was only promulgated as a response to godless communism and communist theories about the soul and the body, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of crummy if you promulgated a religious dogma binding on all Catholics just because you wanted to give a political theory a smack in the butt. Uh, but sometimes that's the way it goes. So that's a brief history of Ex Cathedra, and the only thing that I want to point out especially about all these Ex Cathedra proclamations is that absolutely none of them were necessary. Absolutely none of them actually had to be made. They have pretty much all been overall mistakes to make because none of them have a real impact on the gospel. None of them have a real impact on Christianity. Does it matter whether the Eucharist that people perform is that just a symbolic ceremony or is Christ actually present in that? I mean, you can get a lot more out of the ceremony if you believe Christ is really in there somewhere. But as somebody who came up in a church where there was a lot, it was just basically thought of as symbolism, you still get a lot out of it. Now, I guess that maybe if you actually believe that you're holding real flesh and blood in your hands and you don't know exactly how, but wow, what a miracle that is, you can get stuff out of that too, and maybe you can get more. I know there's kind of a you are what you eat kind of motif in Catholicism and Orthodoxy on account of, you're taking this substance into you that is now merging with your own substance and kind of like you're merging with God. So there's deeper levels that you probably can get out of a real presence thing, but I would in no way say that whether you believe that is real flesh and blood somehow is in any way important. With regard to Mary, who cares whether she was immaculately conceived? I mean, she didn't die for our sins. And whether Mary, experienced death or didn't, this isn't important. Those are not important things. They have nothing to do with salvation. They have nothing to do with the core of the gospel itself. All of these things were just to basically put hedges around Catholic belief in a way that makes them incompatible with the beliefs of other denominations. And that's my main criticism of the whole ex cathedra thing, is that it's only ever been used to divide Catholicism even further from the other denominations so that the chances of unity are that much less. Because every time you set up a hard and fast rule and say, this is what you must believe, you're basically saying, if you don't believe this, you're not really one of us. And you can't be one of us. Don't even think about joining us. Because you have to believe these things. There are, and I remember when I was looking at joining the Orthodox Church, there were certain things that, if you're coming from a Protestant background, you are required to repudiate certain beliefs. And I don't know, I lost interest in Orthodoxy before I ever got to that point, but I don't know if I really would have been able to honestly say that I repudiated some of those particular beliefs. But yeah, every time the Catholic Church has used that power of ex cathedra preaching, it's been just a dumb move. I mean, literally a dumb move. Because all you've done is make it that much harder for the other Christians who are outside the fold to come into the fold. And especially for things like Catholic and Orthodox denominations, who are the original denominations, to merge again. It's the ex cathedra teaching about the powers of the Pope is probably one of the most just shoot yourself in the foot kind of teachings that Catholicism has ever developed. So, oh well, it's there. I don't know how they're ever going to get out of it unless, maybe there's going to be a pope someday who ex cathedra teaches something that's exactly the opposite of what the church has always taught, and they realize, well, this ex cathedra stuff is garbage. But I don't know. I think a lot of the popes are careful, just as Pope Francis has been careful in his approval of civil unions, which is just the political and legal and economic aspect, and nothing to do with the sexual aspect of gay couples. I think popes know better than to try and actively destroy Catholicism. I'm Mike Partika. This has been the latest installment of Don't Take This as Gospel, and I will talk to you later.